Let's talk about the Gamebox GBHD Advance, a consoliser kit for the Game Boy Advance that lets you play your Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games on your TV. I've recently received this, and after playing around with it, I thought a video needed to be made. It's really difficult to find quality footage of this thing on YouTube, and there are some issues I'd really like to address. I'm not going to go too far into detail on this thing, as there are far better videos from the likes of Macho Nacho and Doobsenhauer, sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly, that do a great job of explaining the system. Once you've built the system and have it hooked up, you're greeted with glorious 720p video. Both 480p and 1080i are available too. 1080i doesn't work with my TV, and there are also some issues with 480p. We'll get to that later. 720p might not sound like much, but even at this resolution, the GBA is still being scaled 4 times its native resolution, which results in some nice chunky pixels. If you have a 4K TV capable of nearest neighbour upscaling, then you can get a 12x integer scaled image. That is pretty rad. You open the options menu by holding start and select for a second or two. Within the display settings menu, you can access options for output resolution and scaling. If you were dropped on your head as a child, you might want to stretch the image unevenly to fill the full screen. I leave it on prop or proportionate scaling and enjoy the correct aspect ratio. There are overscan options which can have varying effects depending on the resolution and scaling mode, but so far, I've had no need to use them. Within the picture and miscellaneous config menu item, you can access other video options. Some helpful, some borderline nonsensical. There are filters available, but they're all awful, and I genuinely have no idea why they were included. Enhanced does not enhance the image, and instead makes it dark whilst adding some weird sharpening effects. Smooth seems to apply a small horizontal blur, which just looks like the phase is incorrect. Finally, we have Sharp, which looks... yeah. Gamma correction is arguably the most useful feature. As the original GBA's screen was so dark, many games used stupidly saturated and bright colour palettes, which look weird when viewed on a backlit display. Correcting the gamma makes things less eye-searing and allows games like Castlevania Harmony of Dissonance here to look a lot more natural and creepy. I'd advise leaving this on for just about everything. Next, we have grid lines, which are misaligned. This may not bother you, but for me it makes the feature totally useless. I'm not sure how this was missed before the firmware was flashed onto the units. You can change the size of the grid to your taste, but the only one that correctly lines up just doesn't look natural. We also have scanlines at 2x, 1x, and half the resolution of the content. None of these modes look particularly nice to me, so I leave them off. At least they line up though. There is a lit kit feature that makes the unit have its own private disco when activated. This is massively distracting for me, so I'm just going to leave this off. Last, but definitely not least, is another useful feature. Remapping A and B to B and Y on your SNES controller. This feels so much more natural, and I highly recommend doing this. All of these settings can be saved, so you don't need to screw around with them each time you power up the unit, which is nice and convenient. It goes without saying that the image quality is absolutely stunning. It looks like an emulator, but this is definitely a real-life GBA. Despite using high-quality HDMI cables, I have noticed some occasional signal drops, but this may have more to do with my HDMI splitter not liking the off-spec signal. I've found that starting up the console, then power cycling my HDMI splitter seems to help a lot. This is something to bear in mind if you're planning to record and stream on 2 separate displays. Speaking of recording, if you want more than 720p and don't want to deal with 1080i, You can always use the 480p option and scale the image to 960p within OBS using point interpolation. This does amplify any colour space artifacts from your capture card if you're using YUY2 or NV12. If you use XRGB, the image is crisp, but then it suffers from a range mismatch on my capture card. There is a pretty big problem with this though. Can you hear that? Yeah, no audio. This is actually down to my capture card as my TV still produces sound. It can be fixed with an HDMI audio extractor, but that's an additional purchase you might need to take into consideration. The sound issues don't end there, and that brings me on to my biggest issue with the device. Listen to this. Is it me? Or does that sound like absolute shit? It seems as though the audio is internally clipping somewhere within the unit, which results in this distorted sound. In Metroid Zero Mission, I can reduce this a little bit by selecting headphone mode, but this is a rare feature in GBA games. Needless to say, this is extremely disappointing when paired with the amazing image quality. Depending on the game, you might not notice it as much, and it doesn't seem to be audible in Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. This leads me to my final point. This version of the GBHD Advance has been released with buggy firmware, such as improperly implemented features and a pretty severe audio issue. How do you update the firmware? Not via USB, nah. You need to go out and buy an additional flasher for the unit for another 20-ish pounds, as well as a way of connecting it to the FPGA board. For me, this is absolutely unacceptable. A company shouldn't release a buggy product to the market and expect their customers to shell out more money in order to fix the bug that was left in. The pixel grid isn't something that I'm going to use, but I know many people see that as a core look of the GBA, much like scanlines with non-handheld consoles. The audio, however, is a bigger issue. I bought this because I wanted a solution that would allow me to play original hardware on my TV with none of the hiccups of emulation. In this case, the more expensive option actually has more severe issues, and the fact that I'm going to need to spend more money to get this issue fixed feels like an additional kick in the bollocks. Don't get me wrong, I don't want to be too negative about this, and I know Gamebox is a small company. This is still a great product, and the fact that it's somehow outputting sound and video from a beat-up GBA that I found on eBay is literally like magic to me. However, if I'd been aware of the information that I'm sharing here, I'd have been less keen to put down my hard-earned money on it. Anyway, enough of the negative stuff. Let's have a look at some more footage from the GBHD Advance, and you can decide for yourself whether you think it's worth a buy. Just like a regular GBA, it can play both Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. Let's have a look at the Game Boy. Now remember, by default, the GBA colorizes Game Boy games. If you like this feature for some reason, remember to keep the gamma correction on. Otherwise, you'll face some serious retinal offending colors. The GBA and the Game Boy Color also applied some baffling palettes to games like Kirby here. I have no idea what they were smoking. I advise holding left and B as you boot the game to engage grayscale mode. And this is the only time I'd advise turning off the gamma correction. If you do leave the gamma correction on, like I have done by accident in this Batman footage, you can see that the greys become a little bit too dark. Finally, let's look at a few Game Boy Color games. Just like the GBA, leave the gamma correction on to save your eyeballs. So, there you have it. I hope this has been helpful to you if you've been interested in the GBHD Advance. Now this is specifically the GBA version, not the GBA SP model. I don't know if the same issues are present on the latter. Like I said, this is a great product let down by one or two pretty big flaws. While I'm happy that the firmware issues will get fixed, I'm less enthralled that I need to pay to have this resolved. Hey, thank you for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope it was informative. If you enjoyed it or found it informative, please consider doing us a follow on Twitch, where I stream all of this retro bullshit once or twice a week. Otherwise, thanks again for watching. Take care of yourself and have a great day.